He was just a single father trying to get through a Friday night. She was the most powerful woman in the room, and everyone at that table was laughing at her behind her back. What happened next wasn't planned, wasn't rehearsed, and wasn't smart. But it was the moment that changed both their lives forever. One man chose to treat a stranger with basic human decency. Neither of them had any idea what that small decision was going to cost them, or what it was going to give them. If this story finds you tonight, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The restaurant was called Maison Verdière, which was the kind of name that told you immediately how much everything was going to cost and how much the owners wanted you to know it. The lighting was low in that particular way that was less about ambiance and more about hiding the size of the portions. White tablecloths, real silverware, servers who moved so quietly you sometimes forgot they were there at all. Ethan Holloway had been to nicer places. He had also been to worse ones. At 32, he had reached an age where he could read a room without thinking too hard about it. And what he read when he walked into Maison Verdière on a Friday evening in October was a familiar kind of social theater. The kind where everyone was performing a version of themselves they had decided was most impressive. His friend Marcus had invited him. Marcus Delgado, who had a laugh like a foghorn and an uncanny ability to drag Ethan out of the apartment on nights when Ethan had every intention of staying in. "It's just dinner," Marcus had said on the phone 2 days earlier. "Birthday thing. Casey's turning 34. You've met Casey, a few people from the architecture firm, a couple of Casey's college friends. Come. You need to leave the building." Ethan had hesitated. His daughter Lucy was with his sister Joanne for the weekend, a standing arrangement that happened every 6 weeks, and which Ethan always approached with some mixture of gratitude and the particular restlessness of a man who didn't quite know what to do with himself when his most important job temporarily disappeared. He could have stayed home. He could have watched something on TV or slept past 6 in the morning for once. Instead, he put on a decent shirt and took the subway to Midtown. There were 9 people at the long table when he arrived. Marcus waved him over immediately, pulling out the chair to his left, and Ethan settled in and ordered a beer and said the necessary hellos. He recognized Casey from 2 previous encounters, a compact, cheerful woman who worked in interiors and who always seemed vaguely surprised to find herself the center of attention at her own celebrations. He met her friend Donna, who was loud in a way that was endearing at first. He met a man named Patrick, who spent the first 10 minutes explaining his fantasy football standings to no one in particular. He met a woman named Gretchen who worked with Casey and who seemed, from the moment they were introduced, to be performing a continuous internal calculation about everyone around her. There was a chair empty to Ethan's right. He didn't think much about it for the first 30 minutes. People were late. It happened. He ordered a second beer and got into a decent conversation with Marcus about a bridge renovation project they had both read about, and the table hummed with the usual first hour of a dinner energy. Everyone slightly self-conscious, everyone trying to figure out the social geometry of the evening. Then Donna leaned across the table toward Casey and said, in a voice she clearly thought was quieter than it was, "Is she actually coming?" Casey made a small, complicated face. "She said she was." "How old did you say she was again?" 59. But Marcus said, 59, Donna repeated, as if confirming a diagnosis. Marcus cleared his throat. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. He caught Ethan's eye for half a second and then looked away. Ethan put his beer down. "Who are we talking about?" "Nobody," Marcus said. "Victoria Ashcroft," Casey said, because Casey had always been more straightforward than Marcus. She owns Ashcroft Global, the investment firm. She's Marcus's boss's boss, basically, and apparently she mentioned to someone at work that she'd been spending too many weekends alone, and somehow that got turned into, "It's not a setup," Marcus said too quickly. "It's a little bit of a setup," Donna said cheerfully. The table had drifted into 2 conversations by then, and only about 4 of them were following this one. Patrick had resumed the fantasy football monologue. Gretchen was checking her phone under the table with practiced invisibility. "She doesn't know that," Ethan said. "She might," Casey said, looking slightly guilty. "I don't know what Marcus told her exactly." "I told her it was a birthday dinner," Marcus said. "That's all I told her. And the fact that Ethan would be here, single, at 32, I didn't—" "You mentioned it." Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. I may have mentioned it. Ethan looked at him for a moment. So she thinks she's coming to a birthday dinner and she might be walking into something she doesn't know she's walking into. It's fine, Donna said. It's casual. It's just dinner. Ethan picked his beer back up and said nothing. He had opinions about what was happening, but he had learned, mostly through experience, that the gap between having an opinion and needing to voice it was larger than people usually left room for. He thought what was happening was not kind. He thought Victoria Ashcroft, whoever she was, deserved to know the actual nature of the evening she'd been invited to. He thought the quiet amusement already running around the table, the little smiles and sideways glances, was the kind of behavior that people told themselves was harmless because nobody was being explicitly cruel. He drank his beer. He waited. She arrived 17 minutes later. Victoria Ashcroft walked through the door of Maison Verdier the way certain women walk into rooms, not performing it, not trying to own it, but simply occupying it with a calm self-possession that came from decades of doing exactly that. She was tall, or seemed tall, and she was wearing a dark coat over a gray dress that cost more than Ethan's monthly rent without looking like it was trying to. Her hair was silver, cut cleanly, and her face was the face of a woman who had spent 59 years accumulating something that had never quite resolved itself into satisfaction. She paused at the entrance and looked for the table. Ethan watched her face while the rest of the table arranged their expressions. He couldn't have described it precisely. It was the thing that happened in the half-second before a person located their destination, when they were briefly exposed to the room before the room had registered them. In that half-second, Victoria Ashcroft looked like someone who had done the math on whether coming tonight had been worth it and was still waiting for the answer. She found the table. She smiled. The table smiled back, politely, in the way that people smile when they are adjusting expectations in real time and being careful not to let it show. Marcus stood up. Victoria, glad you made it. Traffic, she said, which was an explanation rather than an apology. She handed her coat to a server without looking, which was the kind of automatic gesture that came from years of being in rooms with people who did that for you. She sat down in the empty chair to Ethan's right. Victoria, this is Ethan, Marcus said. Structural engineer. We went to school together. Hi, Ethan said. Hi, she said. She had green eyes. He noticed that the way you notice things when you weren't specifically looking for them. She opened her menu with the same efficiency she'd probably applied to everything in her life and said, to no one in particular, "What's good here?" "The fish," Casey said. "The halibut is supposed to be excellent." "I'll have the halibut." The waiter appeared. Victoria ordered the halibut and a glass of something Ethan didn't recognize. And then the table resumed its earlier energy with a slight adjustment, a recalibration that Ethan could feel more than see. The conversations tightened. Donna's voice got a fraction louder. Patrick's fantasy football statistics found a new audience. Gretchen, sitting directly across from Victoria, said, "So, Ashcroft Global. That's investment, right?" "Asset management," Victoria said. "Among other things." "Sounds impressive." "It's mostly meetings," Victoria said. A few people laughed. Ethan smiled because it was actually funny. The delivery was dry and self-deprecating and had the rhythm of someone who had said it before and knew it still worked. He glanced at her and she was looking at the table, touching the stem of her glass, and for a moment her expression was unguarded in the particular way that happened when you said a joke and then waited to see if the room received it the way it was meant. They did, sort of. The laughter was polite, appropriate, the kind that doesn't require much from anyone. She adjusted something in her posture, barely perceptible, the kind of micro-adjustment you learn to watch for if you'd spent enough time observing people under pressure, and lifted her wine. Ethan looked away. 40 minutes into the dinner, while the main courses were being distributed with the quiet efficiency of a well-run establishment, Donna said something that she would later probably remember as just a comment and which landed, to Ethan's ear, like a small grenade. She was telling a story about a mutual friend's recent engagement, younger couple, late 20s, very sudden. And she had been building toward a punchline about the age gap between the couple, and she delivered it with the confidence of someone who had told the story several times and knew where the laughs came. And his mother said, "At least she's not older than me." The table laughed. A real laugh this time, genuine, the kind that made people relax. Victoria laughed too. But Ethan watched, and what he saw was that the laugh came one beat late. Just one. The kind of delay that wouldn't register unless you were specifically watching for it. The kind that happened when someone understood the joke and also understood what it meant in the context of why they were at this table on this particular Friday. She laughed, and then she picked up her fork, and her face went back to being composed, and she ate her halibut. Gretchen said, still riding the laughter, "Age gaps are so complicated. People judge so much." "They really do," Donna agreed, "though I guess it depends on the direction." "What do you mean?" "I mean, older man, younger woman, everyone's seen it a million times. Older woman, younger man. People still make a whole thing about it." "Which is ridiculous," Casey said. "Obviously ridiculous," Donna said, in the tone of someone who found it somewhat less obviously ridiculous than they were claiming. Victoria had put her fork down. She was looking at the table, or at the middle distance above the table, or at something that wasn't in the restaurant at all. Her expression hadn't changed in a way that would have been visible to anyone not specifically watching, but her hands were in her lap now, and her halibut was sitting there getting cold, and Ethan could see, clearly and without question, that she had understood exactly what this dinner was. Not just a setup, a test, a social experiment conducted by people who were curious to see what would happen when you put a woman like that in a room with a man like this, and whether she would do something embarrassing or hopeful or pitiable that they could talk about later. He did not think about it. That was the important thing. He did not stop to consider whether it was his business, or whether it was going to make things awkward, or whether Marcus was going to give him a look. He just opened his mouth and spoke. "I actually think it's more complicated than the direction," he said. The table paused. Donna looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the judgment isn't really about the direction, is it? It's about the assumption that one person must be getting something out of the other person, and that they can't actually just be with each other because they want to be." He lifted his beer. "It's a failure of imagination, mostly. People can't picture two people choosing each other outside of their expected bracket, so they have to invent a reason." The table was quiet for a moment. "That's a very diplomatic way to say people are shallow," Gretchen said, which got another laugh. "Sure," Ethan said. "That works too." He did not look at Victoria. He kept his eyes on the middle of the table and finished his beer and let the conversation move on around him, which it did, because conversations at dinner parties always moved on. But Victoria reached for her wine glass, and when she did, her elbow brushed his arm, the smallest, most accidental contact, and she said quietly, just to him, "Thank you." "For what?" he said. She looked at him directly then, for the first time since she'd sat down. She had eyes that had been looking at rooms full of people for 30-something years of board meetings and negotiations and late-night conference calls, and she turned them on him with the full weight of whatever she had collected in those years, and she said, "You know what for?" He did. He didn't pretend otherwise. "It was just an observation," he said. "Sure it was," she said, and picked up her fork and finished her halibut. Dumb. The dinner ended the way dinners like that usually ended, in the limbo of the second dessert course, when the energy had peaked and everyone was calculating how much longer they needed to stay to have technically attended. Casey blew out the candles on a small cake that the restaurant had been tipped off to provide. Someone ordered digestifs. The conversations had that slightly frayed, overextended quality of people who had said most of what they had to say to each other. Victoria excused herself just after 10. She thanked Casey for the invitation, wished her a happy birthday with a warmth that seemed genuine rather than performed, shook hands with two people and nodded to the others, and then paused at Ethan's end of the table. "It was good to meet you," she said. "You too," he said. She put on her coat. She walked out the door of Maison Verdier with the same self-possessed calm she'd walked in with, and she didn't look back, and the table watched her go and then turned back to each other. "Well," Donna said. "She was nice," Casey said, which was not exactly what she meant. "Very composed," Gretchen offered. Marcus caught Ethan's eye. Ethan raised both eyebrows very slightly, which was the most he was going to say on the subject in this particular company, and Marcus had the grace to look somewhat ashamed of himself. Ethan stayed another half hour. He said his goodbyes, tipped more than he needed to out of some reflexive guilt about the whole evening, and walked out into the October night. The subway platform was mostly empty at that hour. He stood waiting, hands in his jacket pockets, and thought about Lucy. Whether she'd had a good day, whether Joanne had remembered that she didn't like the grape juice, just the apple. And he thought briefly about the woman who had sat next to him for 2 hours and laughed one beat too late and known exactly what the evening had really been. He thought, that's a person who is tired. Not in the way people got tired from work or bad sleep. In the older way. The way you got when you'd been running hard in a particular direction for long enough that you'd stopped asking whether it was the right direction. The train came. He got on it. He thought about something else. Fog. He moved to the Caldwell building on a Thursday in November, 11 days after the dinner. It was not a building he had been looking for specifically. His lease on the old apartment had run out at the end of October, and he'd had 3 weeks to find somewhere new. And the Caldwell was the place that had a 2-bedroom open at the right time at a price that wasn't aggressively insulting, with good light and a school within walking distance and a super who had returned his calls promptly. He had signed the lease on a Tuesday and spent the better part of a Wednesday and Thursday moving boxes with his brother-in-law's truck. Lucy had supervised from the doorway of her new bedroom, issuing instructions about where her things should go with the confident authority of a 6-year-old who had decided that moving was primarily an organizational exercise. The bookshelf goes by the window, she said. It's heavy, Luce. It should still go by the window. It went by the window. By 7 in the evening on Thursday, Ethan had assembled enough furniture that the apartment felt like something closer to a home than a storage unit, and Lucy was eating cereal for dinner because neither of them had the energy for anything more ambitious, and Ethan was standing in the kitchen trying to remember where he'd packed the coffee maker. He heard footsteps in the hallway, a door opening, then closing. He didn't think about it. Buildings had neighbors. Neighbors moved around. It was a building. Friday morning, he was leaving with Lucy. School drop-off, then straight to the office. And he came out of his apartment and turned toward the elevator and stopped walking. Victoria Ashcroft was standing in the hallway in a coat and carrying a leather briefcase and looking at her phone, and she looked up when she heard his door close, and for a full 2 seconds, neither of them said anything. Well, she said. Hi, he said. Lucy looked up at the woman in the coat, assessed her with the thorough efficiency of a 6-year-old gathering data, and said, Are you our neighbor? I appear to be, Victoria said. I'm Lucy. Victoria. That's a long name, Lucy said. It is, Victoria agreed. Your father can probably explain why parents do that. She said it without looking at Ethan, but there was the edge of something in her voice. Not quite amusement, not quite accusation. And Ethan said, Come on, Luce, and pressed the elevator button. The three of them rode down together in the particular silence of an elevator that is slightly too small for the coincidence it contains. Ethan stared at the floor numbers. Lucy stared at Victoria. Victoria looked at her phone. In the lobby, they split without ceremony. Victoria toward a black car waiting at the curb. Ethan and Lucy toward the school 2 blocks west. I like her coat, Lucy said as they walked. Yeah, Ethan said. Do you know her? A little. Met her at dinner a few weeks ago. Is she nice? Ethan thought about the woman who had understood exactly what the evening had been, who had laughed one beat too late, who had thanked him for an observation he'd made because it was true, and not because he'd been trying to rescue anyone. I think she might be, he said. And the first real conversation happened over coffee. Not arranged, not planned. Ethan was in the lobby at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning, waiting for the coffee machine near the mailboxes to finish producing what it was generously claiming to be espresso, and Victoria came out of the elevator carrying a travel mug and a folder under her arm, and she saw the machine and said, Does that thing actually work? Technically, Ethan said. Emotionally, no. She looked at it for a moment. I've never used it. Smart. I usually make coffee upstairs. Also smart. The machine finished, and he took the cup, and she stood there for a moment and said, Did you just move in? A few weeks ago. Are you liking it? The building? Yeah, it's fine. The water pressure is a little inconsistent. 7th floor, too, she said. I thought it was just me. Structural issue, probably, he said. Or the pipes are old. The building's, what, Early 90s? 88, she said. I looked it up. I always look up buildings. Habit? She gave him a look that was not quite a smile. I've spent enough time in bad ones. They stood there for a moment longer than was strictly required by the casual nature of the encounter, and then Victoria said she had a car coming, and Ethan said he had school drop-off, and they separated. But that evening, coming back from the grocery store with Lucy pulling the cart because she had decided that was her role, Ethan held the lobby door and found Victoria on the other side of it, also returning. Later than him, coat still on, looking like someone who had been somewhere difficult for longer than they'd planned. Long day? He said. She looked at him. You could say that. We made pasta, Lucy said. There's extra. Victoria looked at Lucy for a moment. Then she looked at Ethan, and her expression did something that he couldn't quite categorize. A small relaxation, barely visible, like something had briefly stopped requiring so much maintenance. That's very kind, she said. You don't have to, Ethan said. I know, she said. She came upstairs. She sat at their kitchen table, which was still slightly uneven because Ethan hadn't found the level yet, and ate pasta that Lucy had helped stir and told them almost nothing about her day and asked Lucy about school and seemed, for about 40 minutes, to be a person rather than a position. When she left, she said, Thank you, This was good. She said it the way people said things when they were not used to saying them. Any time, Ethan said. She nodded and went across the hall to her apartment, and Ethan stood in his doorway a moment longer than necessary, listening to her key in the lock. November became December. They developed a rhythm that neither of them had designed. Elevator conversations, the occasional exchange in the lobby. A Saturday morning, 3 weeks into December, when Lucy knocked on Victoria's door and asked if she wanted to come to the Natural History Museum with them, because, as Lucy explained with complete sincerity, Daddy doesn't understand the dinosaurs as well as he thinks he does. Victoria had opened her door in reading glasses and weekend clothes. Actual weekend clothes, not the architecture of the work week, and looked at Lucy with an expression that Ethan had already started to recognize as the one she wore when something surprised her into almost smiling. Does he not? Victoria said. He said the Brachiosaurus was probably slow, Lucy said, but they weren't. She's right, Victoria said to Ethan. They weren't. I am corrected, Ethan said. Give me 5 minutes, Victoria said. They spent 3 hours at the museum. Victoria knew about dinosaurs in the particular way of someone who had done a lot of reading on a lot of subjects over a long life, and she and Lucy carried on a sustained technical conversation about Mesozoic flora and fauna while Ethan walked alongside them and felt, for the first time in a long while, like something was exactly what it appeared to be. Not complicated, not loaded, just 3 people walking through a museum on a Saturday. Though it was also, somewhere under that, the beginning of something he hadn't asked for and wouldn't have known to want. What he learned about Victoria Ashcroft over those months was not the biography. The biography was available, Ashcroft Global, founded at 37, grown from a boutique firm to a company managing billions across 4 continents. 2 features in major publications, a reputation for being quietly brutal in negotiations and fair, eventually, in judgment. A name that arrived in rooms before she did. What he learned was the other things, that she drank her coffee black but always left the first sip. He never asked why. He figured she probably didn't know, that she had a particular dislike of certain kinds of music, not genres, but specific qualities, a certain kind of manufactured sweetness. And when it came on in a restaurant or a lobby, she would adjust her expression in a way that was almost imperceptible unless you were watching. That she had been married once. She mentioned it exactly once, in passing, in a conversation about something else entirely, and the way she mentioned it, quickly, without weight, with the practiced smoothness of something that had been compressed over a long time, told him more than the words did. That she liked Lucy. Not in the performed way of adults who thought they were supposed to enjoy children, in the way of someone who had spent a long time in the company of people who said things they didn't mean and recognized, with obvious relief, a person who didn't yet know how to do that. Lucy, for her part, had decided that Victoria was in the category of people who deserved full disclosure. which meant that she talked to her with the same uninhibited honesty she talked to everyone she trusted, which was not a large group. "Do you have kids?" Lucy asked, one evening in January when they were all three eating takeout in Ethan's kitchen. Victoria paused. A single beat. "No." "Did you want them?" "Lucy," Ethan started. "It's okay," Victoria said. She looked at her noodles for a moment, then at Lucy. "I thought I would." And then life went a different way. Lucy considered this with the gravity she brought to information that was new and interesting. "Does that make you sad?" "Sometimes," Victoria said. "Less than it used to." Lucy nodded, apparently satisfied, and turned her attention back to her food. Victoria looked up and caught Ethan watching her, and he looked away. There was a night in February, cold, properly cold, the kind of February cold that felt like the city was expressing a personal grievance, when Lucy had a stomach bug and spent most of the night miserable, and neither of them slept much. Around 2 in the morning, Ethan was in the kitchen making tea and listening to the quiet. Lucy had finally dropped off again, and there was a knock at the door. Victoria was standing in the hallway in a robe and slippers, holding a container of something, and she said, without preamble, "I heard her earlier. Is she okay?" Ethan stood there for a moment. "Yeah, she's sleeping now." "I made ginger broth," Victoria said. "It's what my mother used to make. It won't fix anything, but—" She stopped. "I don't know why I made this amount," she said, looking at the container. "Force of habit, maybe. I'll leave it." "Come in," he said. "It's 2 in the morning." "Come in," he said again. She came in. They sat at the kitchen table in the low light and drank tea and didn't talk about anything important, and at some point she said, "You're good with her." And he said, "I'm figuring it out." And she said, "That's the same thing." And he thought about that for a while. She left at 3. He walked her to the door, which was a ridiculous thing to do given that she lived 12 feet across a hallway, but he did it anyway. "Thank you," he said. "For broth?" she said. "For knocking." She looked at him for a moment. "Someone had to," she said. He closed the door and stood in his kitchen and knew, with the clarity of 2 in the morning and no sleep and a kind of quiet that felt important, that something had shifted. He didn't know what to do with that. He put the kettle back on and waited for his daughter to need him and tried not to think about what he'd just understood. The thing about Victoria, Ethan had figured out by March, was that she was fluent in competence. She had spent so many years being the most prepared person in any room that she had built her entire self-presentation around it. The calm, the precision, the way she could assess a situation and move through it without visible hesitation. It was genuinely impressive. It was also, he had come to understand, the armor under the armor. Because there were moments, small ones, brief ones, when she wasn't that. When Lucy said something that made her laugh suddenly, before she could calibrate it. When she came home on a Wednesday evening looking like she'd been in a 12-hour negotiation and stood at her own door for a moment before putting the key in, as if she needed to prepare to enter her own space. When she sat across from him sometimes and her eyes went to a middle distance that had nothing to do with the room they were in. He didn't press. He wasn't built that way. He waited. And he was there. And he left his hallway light on when he knew she was coming home late. A thing he had started doing without deciding to, and which she had noticed and never mentioned. Some things didn't need to be said. Some things were better understood in the dark of a hallway, in a light that was left on, in the particular language of people who had learned to take care of each other without making a production of it. He just didn't know yet where it was going. He had a daughter to raise and a job to do, and a life that had not left a great deal of room for mistakes of the heart. But some nights, standing in his kitchen with the apartment quiet and the hallway light on and the knowledge that she was across the hall in hers, he thought, this is already something. Whatever it is, this is already something, already. Spring came to the city the way it always did. Not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a cold snap, then 2 days of rain that made everything smell like wet concrete and something almost alive underneath it. The trees on the block outside the Caldwell building put out their first green in the second week of March, and Lucy noticed before Ethan did, which was not unusual. She noticed most things before he did. "The tree is waking up," she announced on a Thursday morning, pressing her nose to the lobby window while Ethan fumbled with the zipper on her backpack. Trees don't sleep, Luce. They do in winter, she said, with the certainty of someone who had recently been corrected about dinosaurs and was not going to be caught wrong again. Victoria told me. Victoria told you trees sleep? She said they go dormant, which is like sleeping but for plants. He got the zipper. That's actually accurate. Lucy gave him a look that was 50% satisfaction and 50% something that was going to be a problem when she was a teenager. I know, she said. Outside, the tree continued its argument with March. The rhythm between Ethan and Victoria had settled into something that neither of them was examining too carefully, which was, Ethan understood, both its strength and its risk. They had coffee in the lobby some mornings when their schedules collided. They had dinner together roughly once a week, sometimes at his place, once at hers, where Lucy had been fascinated by the bookshelves that covered 2 full walls of the living room and had to be gently redirected from pulling volumes at random and demanding explanations. She's relentless, Victoria had said, refilling her wine while Lucy interrogated a collection of books on maritime history. Yeah, Ethan said. She gets it from her mother. He had said it without thinking, one of those sentences that came out of some stored-away place before the filter engaged, and then sat with it for a moment, the way you sat with something you'd said that was true and that you weren't sure you'd meant to release into the room. Victoria didn't push. She just said, "She sounds like she was determined," and moved on, and that was another thing Ethan had filed away about her. She understood the difference between an opening and a door. Lucy's mother. Her name was Claire, and she had been 28 years old and 7 months pregnant when the accident happened. And Ethan had been 26 and had spent the 3 years after that becoming the kind of father he hadn't known he was capable of being. Was not a topic he brought out often. He had a therapist he saw once a month who sometimes called him avoidant, and he didn't entirely disagree. And he was working on it in the way you worked on things when you were mostly keeping your head above water. Victoria didn't ask. But sometimes, in the way she watched him with Lucy, carefully, quietly, from the edges of rooms, as if she was reading something she wanted to understand, he had the feeling that she had already assembled most of it on her own. The thing was, she was perceptive in a way that occasionally felt like being seen without having consented to the viewing. He didn't resent it, he just didn't know what to do with it. April arrived with better intentions than March had managed. Ethan's project at work, a structural assessment of a 12-story commercial building in Midtown, whose foundations had started doing things foundations were not supposed to do, had entered the phase that always made him slightly tense, the stage where you knew what the problem was and what fixing it would require, and were now in the process of explaining that to people who had funded the building and did not want to hear any of it. He was spending long days at the office and longer ones at the site, and he came home most evenings with a particular kind of fatigue that lived in the back of the neck. Joanne was helping with Lucy on the late nights. His sister had 2 kids of her own and a practical generosity that never made him feel like a burden, which he appreciated more than he ever found the right moment to say. On a Thursday evening in mid-April, he came home at 8 to find a note tucked under his door in handwriting that was precise and slightly angular. Lucy is with me. She was hungry. V. He stood in the hallway holding the note for longer than made sense. He knocked on Victoria's door. It opened in under 10 seconds, which meant she'd been near it. She showed up at my door at 6:30, Victoria said, stepping back to let him in. She said she'd been knocking on yours for 5 minutes and you weren't home yet. From the couch, Lucy looked up from what appeared to be a very large book about the deep ocean. Hi, Daddy. Hi, Bug. He looked around the apartment. The kitchen smelled like something had been cooked recently. Garlic, something warm. Did she eat? Pasta, Victoria said, and a frankly impressive amount of bread. I was hungry, Lucy said, without looking up. I can see that. He turned to Victoria. You didn't have to. She knocked on my door, Victoria said simply. What was I going to do? It was not a question. It was the answer to a question he hadn't asked, which was, who does that for a 6-year-old who shows up unannounced? Which was, someone who has already decided that child is not a burden. He sat down on the other end of Victoria's couch and let out a breath that had been sitting in his chest since probably noon. Bad day? Victoria said. Long one. The Midtown project? He'd mentioned it. Briefly, in passing, the way you mentioned things to someone you'd started telling things to without formalizing the arrangement. Yeah, the developer is. He's not wrong about the timelines. He just doesn't understand that the building doesn't care about timelines. Buildings have opinions, Victoria said. Structural ones, Ethan said, loudly expressed. She almost smiled. Not quite, but close. That particular arrangement of her face that he'd started cataloging because it was more honest than an actual smile, less curated. She brought him coffee without asking, which was something she had apparently decided was within the scope of whatever this was. And he drank it and listened to Lucy explain the anglerfish, and the evening settled around him like something that fit. The problem, if it was a problem, which he wasn't yet prepared to call it, was that it felt like this. It kept feeling like this. Like something that had been built without blueprints by two people who were both, for entirely different reasons, more comfortable with the practical than the declared. He knew she had been careful. He knew it from the way she moved in these evenings, present but not possessive, warm but with a maintained distance that had nothing cold about it, just a consciousness of lines she had drawn for herself and was not ready to redraw. He respected it. He did. He just also, increasingly, noticed it in the way you noticed a door that was almost open. He thought about it on the walk home from a site visit in late April, in the kind of late afternoon April light that made the city look like it was trying to be kind. He thought, she has been careful because something hurt her. And I have been careful because something hurt me. And we have been building this, whatever this is, in the space between those two careful things. He thought, I don't know what to do with that. He went home. The hallway light was already on. He'd started leaving it on whenever she was expected late. She had a car that brought her home from the office most evenings, and he had gotten a general sense of her schedule in the way you got a general sense of these things when you shared a floor with someone for several months. He left the light on, and he didn't announce it, and she didn't mention it, and it had become one of those things that existed between them without paperwork. She came home at 9:30. He heard the elevator, then her key, then the quiet of a door closing. He was in the kitchen with a book he wasn't reading. Lucy was asleep. He did not go knock on her door. He just sat with the knowledge that she was home and the light was on, and that was the most he was willing to call it tonight. Some things you understood before you could name them. Some things you understood by the fact that the light mattered. The end of April brought something Ethan had not anticipated. Victoria's professional world bleeding, briefly and uncomfortably, into the space they'd built. He came home on a Friday to find two cars on the street outside the building that he recognized as the particular make of black vehicle favored by people who wanted to be unobtrusive and weren't quite managing it. In the lobby, a man in a very good suit was standing near the elevator looking at his phone, and he looked up when Ethan came in and then looked back down, and Ethan categorized him immediately. Security. Private, corporate variety. In the elevator, he passed a woman in her 50s who had the particular exhaustion of someone who had been traveling across time zones and had arrived at the meeting stage of the trip, where politeness was still mandatory but was costing something. He nodded. She nodded back. He got out on the 7th floor. Victoria's door was closed, light under it. He went to his own door, and then he heard her voice through the wall. Not the words, just the tone. And it was the Victoria from before, the CEO Victoria, the one who could compress a negotiation into a sentence and deliver it like a door being locked. Controlled, precise, completely without the color that had come into her voice over months of kitchen table evenings. He had known, obviously, that she was different things to different people. You didn't build what she'd built by being the same person at the dinner table as you were in the boardroom. He understood that. He had a version of it himself. The version of him that walked into a structural review meeting was not the same version that did Saturday morning grocery runs with Lucy, but there was something about hearing it through the wall, the particular efficiency of it, the absence of anything soft, that reminded him with startling clarity of the woman who had walked into Maison Verdier in October and whose laugh had come one beat too late. He stood in his own hallway for a moment. He thought, she has been doing this for 30 years. That version of her is not less real than the one who brings ginger broth at 2 a.m. They are both real. That's the whole thing, that they're both real. He went into his apartment and started dinner and did not think about it again for the rest of the evening, mostly. The people from the cars left around 10. He heard the elevator. He heard the hallway go quiet. 15 minutes later, his phone buzzed with a text from a number he'd had for about 3 months. Is it too late for tea? He typed back, No, come over. She came over in the clothes she'd changed into, jeans, a soft sweater, no armor, and she sat at his kitchen table and put both hands around the mug he gave her and didn't say anything for a full minute. Hard night? He said. Complicated. She drank the tea. One of my senior partners is leaving. He's been with the company for 11 years. She paused. He's leaving to join a competitor, which means he was talking to them while he was still with me, which means the last year of conversations we had were... She stopped. Were what? She looked at the mug. Were him telling me what I wanted to hear. Ethan was quiet for a moment. How long did it take you to figure it out? 2 weeks. She said it with the flat precision of someone who was angrier at themselves than at the situation. I should have seen it in January. Maybe, Ethan said. Or maybe you trusted him because you'd worked together for 11 years and that was a reasonable thing to do. She looked up at him. You're being generous. I'm being accurate, he said. There's a difference. She held his gaze for a moment, and in her face was that thing again. The small relaxation, the brief drop of whatever she normally held up. And then she looked away and drank her tea, and he let it be. Does it happen a lot? He said. People telling you what you want to hear? People telling me what they think I want to hear, she said. There's a difference. I'm not easy to read, or so I've been told. She said it without vanity, as simple reporting. It creates a gap. People fill the gap with what they assume rather than what's true. That sounds exhausting. It is, she said. She said it without self-pity, which was what made it land differently than it would have from someone else. Just a fact, delivered with the same precision as everything else. It is. Moving on. But she didn't move on immediately. She sat with the tea and the kitchen light and the sound of April outside the window, and she said, You don't do that. Do what? Fill the gap with something easier than the truth. He thought about it. I try not to. It doesn't always work. It works more than you think, she said. He didn't know what to do with that either, so he let it sit on the table between them like something that didn't need to be handled tonight. They sat until almost midnight. Lucy slept. The building settled around them with its old building sounds, the radiator, the distant elevator, the occasional voice from another floor. Victoria talked about the company, about the partner, about the particular loneliness of authority, which was something he hadn't heard anyone name that directly before. The higher up you go, she said, the fewer people there are who will just tell you you're wrong. Not because they don't think it, because the calculation shifts. Disagreeing with someone who holds your career in their hands is a different kind of risk than disagreeing with a peer. I bet, he said. I used to have someone, she said, a colleague early on, Ellen. She would tell me when I was being an idiot with a kind of cheerful directness that I completely took for granted. She paused. She moved to London in 2009. We kept in touch for a while. He heard the while. You miss her. Victoria looked at her hands. I miss having someone who knew me before I was this. She said it with a small gesture that encompassed, apparently, everything. The company, the position, the reputation, the whole careful architecture. It gets harder to find people who can separate the two. I never knew you before, Ethan said. No. But I know the 2 in the morning version, he said. The ginger broth version. The one who argued with Lucy about anglerfish for 20 minutes. I didn't argue, she said. I corrected. There's a difference. She argued, he said. You corrected. It looked a lot like arguing. Victoria's face did the almost smile again. This time it made it the rest of the way. It was a real one. The kind that changed the angles of everything, that showed something she probably wasn't aware of showing. And it lasted only a moment before she recovered it, but he saw it, and he cataloged it, and he thought, there you are. She left at midnight. He walked her to the door again, which was still a ridiculous gesture and which she still didn't comment on, and she said good night. And he said good night, and the door closed, and the hallway was quiet. He stood in his kitchen for a while, thinking about the word she had used. Before I was this, as if she had arrived at a destination and closed the road behind her. He thought, maybe roads like that can go both ways. He didn't know. He didn't have enough information. He had a woman across the hall who laughed one beat too late sometimes and smiled with her whole face when she wasn't expecting to, and a daughter who had already decided that woman mattered, and a hallway light that he left on without thinking. He thought, I'm in trouble. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. May brought warmth in a school project that Lucy had decided required Victoria's direct involvement. The project was about animals with long lifespans, and Lucy had selected the Greenland shark, which could live for roughly 500 years, as her subject. She had first asked Ethan to help her build a poster about it, and he had done his best, but at some point she had decided that her father's grasp of Greenland shark biology was insufficient and had knocked on Victoria's door on a Saturday afternoon with her poster board under one arm and a folder of printed information from her school's library website under the other. Ethan found out when he went looking for Lucy an hour later and discovered her and Victoria sitting on Victoria's living room floor. On the floor, which somehow seemed significant, surrounded by construction paper and markers, having what appeared to be a detailed discussion about deep ocean ecosystems. Victoria was in sweats, reading glasses, hair pulled back. She had a marker in her hand and was drawing something on the poster board with the focused expression she usually applied to quarterly reviews. She recruited me, Victoria said without looking up. She has a way, Ethan said. I can see that. Lucy looked up at him briefly. Victoria knows about the cold water layer, she said. The one where the sharks live. The deep scattering layer, Victoria said. Or near it. The actual... She caught Ethan's expression. I'll explain it to her at an appropriate level. Please, he said. He sat on Victoria's couch and read a magazine he wasn't interested in, while his daughter and his neighbor built a school project on the floor, and the afternoon moved through the windows in long, flat bars of light, and nobody said anything important, and it was one of the better Saturdays he'd had in a long time. Lucy's poster came out well. It had a slightly lopsided shark in the middle and a detailed legend along one edge that was definitely beyond the expected scope of a first-grade assignment, and her teacher sent home a note saying it was the most thoroughly researched project in the class. Lucy gave Victoria a copy of the teacher's note, just slid it under her door in an envelope. Didn't mention it. Victoria texted Ethan. She left me a note. He texted back, I know. A pause. Then, I've kept worse things on my desk. He put his phone down and stared at the ceiling for a moment and thought, not for the first time, that the world was doing something very deliberate with the three of them, and he had not yet decided whether to cooperate with it. He thought, I'm going to cooperate with it. He thought, I don't know what that means yet. But the hallway light was on, and May was warm, and across the hall a woman he had not expected was keeping a 6-year-old's note about sharks somewhere on her desk, and that meant something. He didn't know what to do with that meaning yet, but he was starting to feel quietly, and with some remaining uncertainty, that not knowing was okay, that some things built themselves in the dark, in the small hours, in the margin between what you planned and what arrived. He was starting to feel that whatever was building here was the kind of thing that didn't need to be rushed, that could be trusted to become what it was. He just had to stay in it, keep showing up, leave the light on. He could do that. Summer arrived without asking permission, the way it always did in the city. One week it was May, and the next the sidewalks were radiating heat by 8 in the morning, and everyone had adjusted their internal calendar without ceremony. The Caldwell Building's old HVAC system made a sound like a distant argument whenever it cycled on, and Lucy had named it Gerald. And every morning she said good morning to the vent above her bed with the same sincerity she applied to everything. Ethan had stopped questioning the Gerald situation. There were bigger things to think about. The Midtown project had entered its most demanding phase, the actual remediation work, which meant coordinating between his firm, the contractor, the building's management company, and a developer who had developed a habit of calling at 7 in the morning with questions that were really just anxiety in question form. Ethan was good at his job, which meant he was good at the part where you took a complicated structural problem and translated it into something the building could live with, and less good at the part where you spent 40 minutes on a phone call explaining to a man in a very expensive office that concrete had physics. The building doesn't care about your timeline, Chiksad, he said, one Thursday morning in June, standing on the site in a hard hat and the particular patience you accumulated after years of this. The financing does, said the developer, whose name was Garrett, and who was not a bad man, just a frightened one. Garrett? The alternative to the timeline is the building developing a significant problem in 3 to 5 years that costs 4 times what this costs now. A pause. How significant? Significant enough that we're not having this conversation again because I'm testifying somewhere instead. Another pause. Fine, Garrett said, in the voice of a man who had just decided to be reasonable and was not pleased about it. Ethan hung up and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching a crane move a steel beam with the slow precision of something that understood its own weight, and he thought, I need a weekend. He hadn't taken a real one in 6 weeks. Joanne had offered, twice, to take Lucy on a Saturday so he could, as Joanne put it, do something that doesn't involve a child or a collapsing building. And he had thanked her and found reasons to keep the status quo, which was its own kind of problem that he was not currently examining. On a Friday evening in the second week of June, he came home to find Lucy and Victoria in the hallway outside their respective apartments, engaged in what appeared to be a standoff over a paper bag. What's happening? Ethan said. I brought groceries, Victoria said. I was going to make dinner. Lucy says she wants to help. I can help, Lucy said. I know you can help, Victoria said. I'm explaining that the stove is involved, and your father should probably be present for the stove portion. I've used the stove, Lucy said. With supervision, Ethan said. That's what Victoria would be. I would be terrible supervision, Victoria said. I can acknowledge that about myself. Ethan took the paper bag. Come on, he said, and held his door open. They made dinner, Victoria directing, Ethan executing, Lucy involved in every step that didn't require open flame, which she accepted under protest. Victoria had brought the ingredients for something she called her mother's tomato sauce, which turned out to be a process that took 45 minutes and involved more garlic than Ethan would have guessed, and required a specific sequence of additions that Victoria supervised with the focused attention she probably applied to merger negotiations. You're very particular about this, Ethan said at one point. My mother was very particular about this, she said, and she would have opinions about the heat level. She cook a lot? Every Sunday. She handed him a wooden spoon. Keep stirring. She said the sauce needed attention, not heat. Lucy was at the kitchen table doing something with colored pencils and listening to everything, which was her preferred mode of operation in rooms where adults were talking. Visible, apparently occupied, completely attentive. What was she like? Lucy asked. Your mom. Victoria glanced at her. Practical, she said. She didn't have a lot of patience for things that weren't real. What does that mean? It means she didn't like when people said one thing and did another. She paused. She had a way of looking at you when she thought you were being dishonest with yourself. Just looking. You always knew. That sounds scary, Lucy said. It was useful, Victoria said. Eventually, Ethan stirred the sauce. The kitchen smelled extraordinary. Outside, the city was doing its Friday evening thing. The particular mix of traffic and voices, and the distant sound of somewhere being cleaned or constructed, and in here was garlic and tomatoes, and the comfortable sound of 3 people being in the same room without needing to justify it. He thought, this is what I've been building toward. Not just tonight, all of it. This exact temperature of a thing. And then he put that thought down before it could become something he had to act on. Dinner was good. The sauce was, in fact, better than anything he'd made from a jar in 6 years of being a single father, and he said so, and Victoria said obviously with zero self-deprecation, which made Lucy laugh so hard she inhaled pasta. After dinner, while Ethan was doing dishes and Victoria was sitting with the last of her wine, and Lucy was somewhere in the approximate vicinity of her bedroom, Lucy's voice came from the hallway. Victoria. Yeah? Footsteps. Lucy appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her school clothes, holding a stuffed animal that had been through several arguments with the washing machine, and showed it. She looked at Victoria with the direct assessment she reserved for things she had decided mattered. Why don't you live here? She said. The kitchen went quiet. Not awkward quiet, just the kind of quiet where something true had entered the room and everyone was adjusting. Victoria looked at Lucy for a moment. I live across the hall, Bug. That's basically the same building. Same building, different apartment. But you're here all the time, Lucy said, and you make the good sauce, and you know about the sharks. She hugged the stuffed animal to her chest and said, with the complete unself-consciousness of someone who hadn't learned yet that some things were better left unsaid, Daddy is better when you're here. He doesn't make the worried face as much. Ethan stopped washing the dish in his hand. Victoria's expression did something complicated. She looked at Lucy first, then at Ethan, and then at the table, and something moved across her face that he didn't have a name for, something that had been held for a long time under a lot of pressure and was finding a crack. "Lucy," Ethan said, keeping his voice level, "go put your pajamas on." "I'm just saying, pajamas." Lucy assessed the room with the thoroughness of someone who was not yet sure whether she'd helped or made things harder. And then she went down the hall, and the kitchen was quiet again, in a different way than before. Ethan set the dish down on the counter and turned around. Victoria had both hands flat on the table. She was looking at them. "I'm sorry," he said. She says what she's thinking." "I know," Victoria said. "She's right." He didn't say anything. "She's right that I'm here a lot," she said. "And she's probably right about the rest of it." She said it carefully, the way you said things you had prepared and then said anyway because holding them was getting too heavy. "I don't want to—" She stopped, started again. "I've been aware for a while now that this—" Another pause, and she made a small gesture that encompassed the kitchen and the dinner and the sauce and all 7 months of the thing they'd been carefully not naming, that whatever this has become, it's not nothing. To me. Ethan stood very still. "And I've been—" She exhaled. "I've been trying to be careful about what I want. Because wanting things and having them be right are not always the same. And you have—" She gestured toward the hallway, meaning Lucy, meaning the whole shape of his life. "You have everything that matters already. You don't need me to come in and complicate it." "That's not your decision," he said. She looked up. "Whether you'd complicate it," he said. "That's not yours to decide, that's mine." Her hands were still flat on the table. She was watching him with those eyes that had been watching rooms full of people for 30 years, and had gotten, over the last 7 months, significantly more careful than usual about one particular room. "I made a decision," she said, "a long time ago, after a very bad few years, that I was done expecting love to show up and be reasonable, done expecting it to make sense. I decided I was better at the other things, the work, the company." She said it without bitterness, just the clean inventory of a woman who had rearranged her expectations and made peace with the rearrangement. "And then you left your hallway light on." He didn't move. "That was a year ago," he said quietly. 8 months, she said. "But the counting is the problem, isn't it? The counting means it's been a while." "Victoria, I'm not good at this," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I don't have a good record. I have 30 years of being very clear about what I want in a boardroom and much less clear about what I want in a kitchen at 8 o'clock on a Friday night." "I'm not asking you to be good at it," he said. "You should," she said. "You have Lucy. You should ask for someone who has it figured out." "Nobody has it figured out," he said. "Ethan, nobody," he said again, and his voice had more weight in it now than he usually let it carry. "You think I have it figured out? I'm a 32-year-old single father who has been leaving the hallway light on for 8 months and calling it a habit. I have not had it figured out for a single day since I was 26. He stopped, took a breath. "All I know is what's in this kitchen. What's been in this kitchen for 8 months. And I'm not going to pretend I don't know what it is." The kitchen was very quiet. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Really looked. The full weight of it, no management, no careful distance, just the woman behind all of it looking at the man across the kitchen. Then she asked why I wasn't already part of the family. "She's 6, he said. "She's right," Victoria said. And then she reached across the table, and she didn't say anything else. And neither did he. And he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and she stood up, and it was not perfectly timed or gracefully done, or the way these things happen in movies. Her chair scraped the floor. He almost knocked the wine glass. Her hand came up against his chest first, and then his face. And when they finally kissed, it was the kind of first kiss that had 6 months of weight behind it, clumsy and careful and real. He pulled back first. She kept her hand on his face. "I've been terrified of this," she said. "I know. I'm still terrified." "That's okay," he said. "I am too." She let out a breath that was not quite a laugh, but had some of the same relief in it, and she sat back down, and he sat across from her, and for a moment they just existed in the kitchen with the mess of dinner and the fact of what had just happened between them. And it was not neat, and it was not resolved. It was the very beginning of something that would require a great deal of them both, and they both knew it. "Lucy's going to be unbearable about this," Ethan said. "Lucy's going to be exactly right about this," Victoria said. "Which is worse?" He almost laughed. Actually laughed. A real one, short and surprised. And she smiled, and it was the full smile again, the unguarded one. And this time she didn't pull it back. Lucy from down the hall called, "Did something happen? It got quiet." "Pajamas," Ethan called back. "I have them on." "Then stay in them." A pause. Then, "Okay." A beat. "Is Victoria still there?" "Yes." Another pause, satisfied this time. "Good," Lucy said, and the sound of her bed creaking under the weight of a 6-year-old who had decided she was done for the evening. Victoria looked at the hallway and then at Ethan, and she said quietly, "She knew before either of us." "She usually does," he said. "That's terrifying." "You get used to it." Victoria shook her head, but there was something in her face now that had not been there at the beginning of the evening, or rather, had been there all along, under everything, and was now less carefully covered. Something that was not quite hope, but was in the same neighborhood. Something that had been dormant, like a tree in March, and had finally decided it was warm enough. It was not simple from there. That would have been a different kind of story. And this was not that. The first complication arrived from Victoria's world, specifically in the form of a woman named Sylvia Crane, who was the head of communications at Ashcroft Global and who had worked for Victoria for 6 years and who had an institutional memory of every professional decision Victoria had ever made, including the ones that hadn't worked. Sylvia called on a Sunday morning, which was already unusual, and the call lasted 35 minutes, which Ethan knew because he and Lucy were eating breakfast, and Victoria was in the living room with the door half open, and he could hear the cadence of it. Not the words, but the frequency, the way it went from measured to controlled to something under the controlled that he recognized. When she came back to the kitchen, she said, "I have to go in." "On Sunday?" "There's a situation with a portfolio company." She was already in the mode. Efficient, compiled, the armor assembling itself in real time. "I'm sorry." "You don't have to apologize," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. They were officially 3 days into whatever they were now calling what they were, and neither of them had found quite the right language for it yet. And there was the additional fact of Sylvia and the portfolio company and the car that would be downstairs in 8 minutes. "I'll try to be back by dinner," she said. "Don't try to be back by dinner," he said. "Be back when you're done." She paused. "That could be late." "I'll leave the light on," he said. She was quiet for a second, then, "That stopped being a joke about 6 months ago." "It was never a joke," he said. She left. Lucy watched her go with the expression of someone filing information away. "She had to work," Ethan said. "I know," Lucy said. "She works a lot." "She does." Lucy stirred her cereal. "Is that going to be a problem?" He looked at his daughter, who was 6 years old and eating cereal, and had just asked, with complete seriousness, a question that cut directly to one of the 2 or 3 things he was genuinely unsure about. "I don't know yet," he said, because she deserved an honest answer. Lucy considered this. "Okay," she said, and went back to her cereal, and that was that. She was back by 9. Not dinner 9. Late 9. The kind where the city had quieted down to its baseline, and most of the lights in the building were off. He heard the elevator. He heard her door, and then a few minutes later, a knock on his. She was still in work clothes. She looked like someone who had solved a problem, and the solving of it had cost her something she would not get back until morning. "The light was on," she said. "Come in," he said. "I'm exhausted," she said. "I just wanted—" She stopped. "I just wanted to see you." He opened the door wider. She came in and sat on his couch and did not become the CEO and did not explain the portfolio situation and did not apologize for the Sunday or the lateness. And he made tea, and they sat together in the low light of his living room while the city did its quiet thing outside, and she fell asleep on his couch at some point before 11 with her shoes still on and a half-finished mug of tea on the coffee table. He found a blanket. He turned the lamp down. He stood there for a moment, watching her sleep in the way that you watch someone sleep when you had just recently admitted to yourself that they mattered in a way you couldn't measure or manage. She looked asleep, like someone who had stopped performing, like the face she had before everything that had come after. Tired, yes, but underneath the tired, something younger, something that had been waiting a long time to put everything down. He went to bed. He left the living room lamp on, very low. In the morning, she was gone before he woke up. A note on the coffee table in the precise, angular handwriting he recognized. "Thank you for the light." Lucy found it first. She read it, looked at her father, and said nothing, which meant she understood completely. She tucked the note into the pocket of her school uniform. Kept it all day. Ethan found it that evening, folded small, on the kitchen table, beside the spoon rest her mother had bought at a craft fair 7 years ago. He left it there. Some things deserved to stay exactly where they were. The note stayed on the kitchen table for 2 weeks. Ethan moved it once, when he was cleaning, and then moved it back without thinking about it, which told him something. Lucy didn't mention it, but she noticed, the way she noticed everything, filing it into whatever internal ledger she kept on the subject of her father and the woman across the hall. July came in hot and stayed that way. The city in July had a particular quality to it. The heat changed the acoustics somehow, made everything sound slightly more urgent. The traffic and the voices and the construction on the block below amplified in a way that had no scientific explanation but felt real anyway. The Caldwells' Gerald worked overtime. Lucy had taken to leaving him small offerings near the vent, a drawing of a sun, a particularly smooth rock from the park, a broken crayon she felt he might appreciate. "Gerald doesn't need a crayon," Ethan said. "He might like the color," Lucy said. Ethan left the crayon where it was. What had shifted between him and Victoria after the Friday night in the kitchen was not dramatic. It was subtle, in the way that the most real changes were subtle. A recalibration of the ordinary, a slight adjustment to the weight distribution of every day. She was across the hall. She had always been across the hall. But now the door between them had a different quality, less like a boundary and more like a pause. They were figuring it out in the way that two people figured things out when they were both, constitutionally, better at doing than discussing. They had dinners. They had mornings. They had the elevator and the lobby and the particular intimacy of two people sharing a floor in an old building that made sounds at night. He walked her to her door, and she held his hand in the elevator. And sometimes, when Lucy was at Joanne's for the weekend, she stayed past midnight and they talked until one of them fell asleep. And none of it had been formally named or declared, which was partly caution and partly the understanding that some things were truer before you tried to put a border around them. But July also brought the thing that had been waiting in the peripheral vision of this new arrangement, which was other people's opinions. The first came from Marcus. Marcus called on a Wednesday, which was unusual. Marcus was primarily a text-based communicator who reserved phone calls for things he felt required tone. And after the opening 30 seconds of general checking in, he said, "So I heard something." "What did you hear?" Ethan said. "That you and Victoria Ashcroft are..." A pause, and Ethan could hear Marcus selecting his words with visible effort. "A thing." "Where did you hear that?" "She mentioned you to someone at work, apparently. In passing, which for Victoria means it meant something." Another pause. "Ethan. Marcus. She's 59. I know how old she is. You're 32. Also aware." "I'm not..." Marcus stopped, started again. "I'm not judging. I want to be clear that I'm not judging. I'm asking, as your friend who knows you, whether you've thought about..." "I've thought about it," Ethan said, "because she's..." "I know who she is," Ethan said. "I've known who she is for 8 months. I've had dinner with her more times than I can count. I know how she takes her coffee and what she's like when a deal goes bad and what her mother's tomato sauce recipe is. I know who she is." A long pause from Marcus. Okay, Marcus said. Okay. I'm your friend, Marcus said. So, okay. He paused one more time. Is she good to Lucy? Ethan thought about the school project, the note on the coffee table, Lucy's ledger. Yeah, he said. She's good to Lucy. Then okay, Marcus said, and changed the subject, and that was Marcus. Not perfect, not without his complications, but willing to update. The second opinion was less straightforward. It came from Victoria's world, which was larger and louder and considerably less interested in anyone's comfort, and it arrived in the form of a profile. A financial publication, one of the large ones, the kind that had existed since before either of them was born and had the institutional authority to make or frame a narrative, ran a piece on Victoria in mid-July. It was, on its surface, a positive piece. Her company was expanding into 2 new Asian markets. The piece covered her career, her record, her strategic vision, with the respectful tone reserved for people whose phone calls got returned. And then, near the end, a paragraph. Ethan read it on his phone while waiting for Lucy to finish at the park. The paragraph said that sources close to Ashcroft described her as recently distracted and noted that she had been seen socially with an unidentified man significantly younger than herself, and that several colleagues had expressed quiet concern about whether her personal life was affecting her focus at a critical expansion period. He read the paragraph twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket and watched Lucy on the swings for a while. He did not say anything to Victoria that evening. He waited to see if she brought it up. She didn't bring it up that evening. She didn't bring it up the next day. On the third day, she came to dinner and she was quieter than usual. Not distant, but compressed, like something was taking up more internal space than she'd allocated for it. And Lucy, who processed the room like sonar, looked between them twice and then announced she needed to do her reading and disappeared with a tact that was not yet natural to her but was clearly being practiced. When the kitchen was quiet, Ethan said, I read it. Victoria looked up from her wine. I figured. You should have told me. I was going to. When? She was quiet for a moment. When I figured out how to tell you without it sounding like what it sounds like. What does it sound like? She set the wine down. Like a warning, like, here's the tax that comes with being connected to me. Here is what my world does with things it doesn't understand. I'm not new to other people having opinions, he said. This is different, she said. These aren't friends. These are people with platforms. People whose version of events becomes the version if you're not careful. She rubbed the side of her neck, a gesture he'd learned was involuntary, the thing her body did when she was carrying more than she wanted to carry. And I've been careful, Ethan, for a long time, about what I give them to work with. And now, she stopped. Now there's something to work with, he said. Now there's something I can't categorize cleanly, or explain in a way that fits their framework. She looked at him. And that doesn't scare you? It was not a question. She had known him long enough to know the answer. No, he said. It should. Maybe, he said. But I've spent 6 years being scared of the wrong things. I got good at it. I don't want to keep being good at it. She looked at him for a moment, and in her face was the thing he had come to understand as the most honest version of her. The version that existed after the armor came down, which happened in his kitchen and not in boardrooms, which was not a small thing, which was, in fact, the whole thing. There'll be more of it, she said. Not just the press, my board, colleagues, people who have decided who I am and don't have room in that version of me for, she hesitated, for this. I know, he said, and it's going to land on you, on both of you. People will say things about Lucy eventually, about what it means that she's growing up around Victoria, he said. She stopped. I'm not leaving, he said. She looked at him. I'm not going to leave because a paragraph in a magazine made it complicated, he said. I'm not that easy to move. Her jaw tightened, briefly, the thing it did when she was holding something in that wanted out. And then she picked her wine back up and said, I know. And then, I'm not used to that. I know that too, he said. They didn't fix it that night. There was nothing to fix. The paragraph existed, and the world outside this kitchen had opinions, and those opinions would continue being had regardless of what was said over dinner. What happened was smaller than fixing. They sat with it together and let it be a real thing between them instead of a thing she was managing alone, and that was different from how she had been handling most real things for a very long time. August arrived, and with it came the complication that neither the article nor Marcus nor any of the social geometry had prepared him for, which was, specifically, meeting Richard Ashcroft, Victoria's ex-husband. She had mentioned him exactly once, 8 months ago, in the compressed and practiced way of someone who had reduced a significant thing to a manageable size. What Ethan had assembled since then from context was they had been married for 9 years, divorced for 14. The split had been the kind that left no obvious villain and a great deal of quiet damage, and they had no children and limited ongoing contact. The limited ongoing contact part was what made Richard's appearance on an August Saturday afternoon in the lobby of the Caldwell building a surprise to everyone, including Victoria. Ethan was coming back from the hardware store with Lucy, who was carrying a bag of things she had decided were essential and which were mostly stickers. And he held the lobby door, and a man walked through it who was roughly 60, silver-haired, well-built in the way of someone who had maintained themselves carefully for decades, and who stopped when he saw Ethan and Lucy with the particular expression of someone who had expected something, but not this. "Hi," Ethan said, because the man was standing in his building's lobby looking at him. "Hi," the man said. Then, "I'm looking for the 7th floor." "Elevator's there," Ethan said. The man nodded but didn't move immediately. He was looking at Lucy now, with the particular blankness of someone recalculating. "Are you a friend of Victoria's?" Lucy said, which was Lucy's version of asking who you were. The man looked at her for a moment. "I'm Richard," he said. "An old friend." "I'm Lucy." "Hello, Lucy." They rode the elevator together, the three of them, in a silence that was more loaded than the one with Victoria 8 months ago, which was already saying something. Richard stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the elevator doors, and Ethan stood and did not perform nonchalance. On the 7th floor, Richard said, "Thank you," and went to Victoria's door. Ethan went to his. He heard the knock. He heard her door open. He heard the surprise in her voice, a single syllable, not quite his name, not quite a question. And then her door closed and his hallway was quiet. He made lunch for Lucy and said nothing about it, and answered Lucy's questions about the hardware store stickers and did not stand near the wall to listen, because that was not who he was. 2 hours later, he heard her door open and close again, and footsteps to the elevator. Then quiet. 20 minutes after that, a knock on his door. Victoria looked like she had spent 2 hours in a conversation that had reached back into something old and pulled. Not destroyed. She was not a woman who got destroyed by things, but rearranged, like a room that had been put back in order, but you could still tell where things had been moved. "You saw him in the lobby," she said. "Yeah. I didn't know he was coming. He's passing through the city. He said he wanted to see if I was—" She stopped, looked at the floor briefly, then back up. "He wanted to see if I was all right. Someone told him about the article. He still has people who—" She exhaled. "He's not a bad man." "Okay," Ethan said. "He wanted to know about you," she said. "About what?" "About what this is." "What did you tell him?" She looked at him directly. "I told him I was happy." She said it simply, which cost her something. He could see that. The directness of the word, the absence of qualification. "I told him I was happy, and I wasn't interested in what he thought about it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Was that true?" "Which part?" "The first part," he said. She looked at him. The full weight of her, all of it. The 59 years, the company, the 30 years of careful armor, the woman who had laughed one beat too late at a dinner table in October and had never quite put that laugh back where she'd found it. Looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It was true." He nodded. She came in. Lucy heard the door and appeared from her room and said, "Is Richard gone?" Which confirmed that she had heard more than anyone had accounted for, and Victoria said yes, and Lucy said, "Good, I didn't like how he looked at Daddy," and both of the adults in the room decided not to examine that further. September was steadier. The Midtown project moved into its final phase. The remediation was complete, the follow-up inspections were scheduled, and Garrett had called with something that was not quite an apology, but was in the same building as one. Ethan wrapped the site on a Thursday afternoon and stood on the sidewalk looking up at the building and felt the particular satisfaction of a structure that would outlast the argument about whether fixing it was worth it. He took Lucy out to dinner to celebrate, a place she had chosen because they had a specific type of macaroni she approved of, and they sat in a corner booth and she told him about a disagreement at school involving library privileges and a boy named Thomas who she felt had been unfairly advantaged. And he listened and gave his honest opinion, which was that the librarian had probably made a reasonable call, and Thomas had perhaps not been as advantaged as it appeared. And Lucy considered this and said, maybe, which was her version of conceding. "Can Victoria come next time?" she said, near the end of dinner. "You can ask her." She said, "I should ask you first." Lucy looked at him. "She does that. She always checks with you before she does things with me." Ethan set his fork down. "Is that okay with you?" Lucy thought about it genuinely, the way she thought about things that mattered. "Yeah," she said. "It feels like she's being careful." She paused. "Like she knows I matter." He looked at his daughter across the macaroni and thought, "You are going to be extraordinary." "She knows," he said. "I know she knows," Lucy said. "I just like that she shows it." He nodded. Outside the restaurant window, the city was doing its September thing, the light going golden earlier, the first suggestion of the turn in the air, summer beginning its negotiated exit. He thought about 8 months ago, and then 14 months ago, and then the Friday night in the kitchen, and Victoria's hands flat on the table and what she'd said, "I told him I was happy." He thought about what it had cost her to say that simply, to not qualify it or frame it or manage its implications. Just happy, present tense, unapologetic. He thought, she's learning to let things be real. So was he. They were doing it at the same pace, which was not a coincidence. October came around again, the year completing its loop, and it landed differently than the October before, which was the point of years. He was in the lobby on a Thursday morning, waiting for the elevator with his coffee and his bag, and Victoria came out of the elevator going the other direction, the black car waiting, the briefcase, the coat. And she stopped and looked at him for a half second with the same expression that had been building since the night she'd sat at his kitchen table and told him she was not good at this. She was better at it than she thought. He'd been meaning to say that. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. "You have the Amsterdam call today?" "This afternoon, 4 o'clock. "You'll be late back." "Probably." He nodded. She was already moving toward the door, the morning requiring her, the car, the office, the company with its 30 years of weight and momentum. She was 3 steps toward the door when she stopped and turned back. "Ethan," she said. He looked up. She looked at him across the lobby, in the morning light, with the coat and the briefcase and all of it, and said, "The light. Don't forget the light." "I never forget," he said. She nodded. She went out the door. The black car took her uptown. He stood in the lobby for a moment, coffee in hand, and thought about what it meant that she had turned back to say that. That she had, without announcement or ceremony, started asking for the thing she needed instead of waiting to see if it would be offered. He thought, that's new. He thought, that took something. He thought, we're going to be okay. He got in the elevator and went up to the 7th floor and went to work and left the light on. The 2nd October was not like the first one. The 1st October had been a dinner table, and a woman who laughed one beat too late, and a man who said something true because it was true, and not because he expected anything from it. The 2nd October was 2 people who had spent a year learning the particular grammar of each other, the pauses and the tells, the places where the armor still held, and the places where it had quietly come down. And who were, without having formally declared it, building something that had weight and history and the kind of density that only came from accumulated ordinary days. Lucy had turned 7 in September. Victoria had baked a cake, which was a significant event, because Victoria did not bake. She had said so flatly when Lucy made the request, said, "I don't bake, I can order something extraordinary from 3 different places." And Lucy had said she wanted Victoria to make it, specifically, And Victoria had stood in Ethan's kitchen on a Saturday morning with a recipe she had found and printed out and annotated in the margins. And she had made a chocolate cake that came out slightly lopsided on one side and was the best thing Ethan had eaten in recent memory. "It's uneven," Victoria said, looking at it. "It's perfect," Lucy said. "It's not—" "Victoria." Lucy looked at her with the full authority of a 7-year-old who had decided. "It's perfect." Victoria looked at the cake for another moment, and then at Lucy. And something moved through her expression that Ethan had seen before, and had come to understand as the face she made when something reached a place she didn't have defended, when something got through not because she lowered the wall, but because the thing was small enough and genuine enough to fit through the cracks she hadn't noticed were there. "Okay," she said. The cake was eaten. The candles were blown out. Lucy made a wish that she refused to disclose to either of them, which was standard Lucy operating procedure. But she looked at both of them afterward with the expression of someone who felt the wish was already in the process of being granted. Ethan had filed that look away. He knew what it meant. He'd been knowing what it meant for a while. What he'd been doing with that knowledge was the more complicated question. The truth, and he was trying, that year, to be more honest with himself than he had historically managed, was that he had been circling something for months. Since the kitchen in June, maybe earlier, since February, and the ginger broth. Since October the first time, if he was being completely honest, which he was trying to be. He had been circling the understanding that this was not a thing that would resolve itself into something smaller, that it was not a chapter, that it was not the comfortable arrangement of two careful people who had found each other across a hallway and were taking it slowly and would continue to take it slowly indefinitely. It was a life. It was going to be a life if he let it, and he was going to have to decide whether he was letting it. He was 33 now. He had been making decisions in survival mode since he was 26, not badly, not without love, but from the position of a man who had learned to prioritize what was immediately in front of him over what might be coming next. Lucy. The job. The apartment. The next thing and the next thing and the next thing. It was how you got through a grief that had no clean edges and a responsibility that required everything you had. But he was not in survival mode anymore. He had not been for a while, and the fact that he had continued to operate as if he were was something his therapist had pointed out in September with the calm specificity that made him feel, as she usually did, mildly outmaneuvered. "You've built something stable," she had said, "and part of you is still waiting for the reason to dismantle it." He had not argued. "The question," she had said, "is whether you're going to let it be what it already is." He had thought about that for 3 weeks. He was still thinking about it when November came in cold and clear, and Victoria flew to Amsterdam for the meetings that had been building since the summer. She was gone for 4 days. He had known she would be gone, had known the dates, and had not anticipated that the apartment would feel as quiet as it did, which told him something he already knew and was apparently still in the process of fully accepting. Lucy noticed within 24 hours. "It's different when she's not here," she said on the second evening. "She travels for work," Ethan said. "She'll be back Friday." "I know," Lucy said. "I'm just saying it's different." He knew. He left the hallway light on anyway, which was either habit or a statement, and on Friday evening when the elevator opened and he heard her key and then her door, he sat in his kitchen and felt something in his chest reset to a level it hadn't been at for 4 days, and that was the information he'd needed. She knocked on his door at 8. She looked like 4 days of transatlantic negotiations looked. Excellent coat, real exhaustion underneath it. The particular flatness of someone who had been performing at full capacity in a foreign time zone and was now at the part of the trip where the performance was done. "The meetings," she said, "went well." "Good." They were also relentless. "Come in," he said. She came in, dropped her bag at the door in a way that was uncharacteristic and that told him how tired she actually was, and sat at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands for a moment. Just a moment, just the brief permission of being somewhere she didn't have to hold it together, and then straightened up. "Lucy asleep?" "About an hour ago." "How was she?" "Good. She has a thing for school on Monday, a presentation about ecosystems. She's been practicing on Gerald." Victoria almost smiled despite herself. What's Gerald's feedback? Apparently supportive. She laughed. A real one, short and tired, and she rubbed her face and looked at him across the table with the specific expression he had been cataloging for a year, the one that only existed in his kitchen, in the grammar of this particular space. I missed this, she said. Here, this room. The kitchen? The kitchen, yes. She paused. And you? She said it in the same tone as the kitchen, flatly and without decoration, which was the Victoria way of saying things that cost something. The less ceremony, the more real. He looked at her for a moment. He had been thinking about what his therapist said. He had been thinking about the circling. He had been thinking about the hallway light and 4 days of quiet and the feeling in his chest when he heard her key in her door. He had been thinking for 3 weeks about what he actually wanted. I need to tell you something, he said. She looked at him. Something in her expression sharpened slightly. Not alarm, but attention. The full attention. He stopped, started again. I've been waiting, he said, for a reason to be careful, for something to go wrong, for the part where it turns out this was complicated in a way I couldn't manage. He paused. And it has been complicated. The article, Richard, Marcus and his phone call. My own, he shook his head, my own stuff, which is still in process and probably will be for a while. She was very still. But none of that changed anything, he said. That's what I kept finding out. Every time something came up, I kept finding out it hadn't changed anything. He looked at her directly. I love you. I've known that for a while. And I've been waiting for the version of myself that was done being scared to say it. And I think this is him. The kitchen was absolutely quiet. Victoria sat across the table from him, and for a moment her face did what it sometimes did. Went into that compressed, held stillness that was not coldness, but its opposite. The thing her face did when something was too important for expression to be trusted. Her hands were on the table. Her eyes were very clear. I'm 60 in February, she said. I know. You're 33. Also aware. People are going to... Victoria, he said, and the way he said it, not unkind, not impatient, but with a firmness that settled the room, made her stop. I know all of that. I've known all of that for a year. It has not changed anything. It will not change anything. He held her gaze. I love you. That's the whole sentence, nothing after the period. She looked at him for a long moment. He watched her face move through something, some internal passage that he couldn't follow, some negotiation between the woman who had spent 30 years being careful and the woman who had told her ex-husband she was happy and meant it, between the version of herself that had all the reasons and the version that had been leaving the lights on too, in her own way, without calling it that. I love you, she said, quietly, plainly. I know I'm not easy. I know what I come with. I know the company and the hours and the way I get sometimes when it's a bad week. And I know I don't always... Her voice was steady, but just barely. I don't always know how to need things out loud. I'm learning. I am genuinely learning. I know, he said. I love you, she said again, as if saying it twice made it more structurally sound. And I love Lucy, and I love this kitchen, and Gerald, and the fact that you leave the light on. She paused. I love that most of all, I think. He stood up. She stood up. They met in the middle of the kitchen. Not gracefully. She bumped the table and he had to move the chair. And when he held her, she was not the CEO, and she was not the woman at Maison Verdier, and she was not the armor and the reputation and the 30 years of careful construction. She was a person, a tired, complicated, extraordinary person who had learned to ask for the light and was still learning how to stay in it. He held on. She let him. After a while, she said into his shoulder, I'm still tired. I know. I might fall asleep on your couch again. Okay. I should go to my own apartment. Or, he said, you could stop doing that. The going back to your apartment thing, as a permanent change. She pulled back slightly and looked at him. He looked back. As in, she started. As in, he said, there's no logical reason for you to be across the hall anymore. She was quiet for a moment. Then, That's a very structural way to propose a change of address. I'm an engineer, he said. I work from evidence. She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that had 30 years and 100 boardrooms and one very bad marriage and one very good kitchen in it, and she said, "Ask me properly." "Victoria Ashcroft," he said, and his voice was even though something in him was not. "Will you stay?" Not move in, not change your life, just stay. Present tense, specific, the whole sentence. "Yes," she said. She said it the way she had told Richard she was happy, simply, without qualification, the way she was learning to say the real things now, one at a time, in the kitchen with no audience, with the weight of having said it fully on her and chosen anyway. They stood in the kitchen for a while. The building settled around them. Gerald ran a cycle on the upper floor, very distantly. She stayed. The staying was not seamless. Nothing about two fully formed, independently operational adults merging their lives into one apartment was going to be seamless, and anyone who had suggested it would be had not spent enough time around actual humans. There were logistics, her lease, her things, the particular archaeology of a person who had lived alone for 14 years and had systems that were not Ethan's systems. There was the fact that she owned approximately 3 times more books than his apartment had shelf space for, which required a conversation, and then a weekend, and then Ethan building 2 additional shelves that were not in the original plan, but were structurally sound. There was the adjustment period of sharing a bathroom, which was its own ongoing negotiation with no final resolution in sight. Lucy's response was to accept it with the equanimity of someone who had already incorporated the event into her world model and was simply satisfied to see reality catching up. "Finally," she said, on the morning that Victoria moved the first boxes across the hall. "Finally," Victoria agreed. "I've been waiting," Lucy said. "I know, Bug. I told Daddy a long time ago that he made the worried face less." Victoria glanced at Ethan over Lucy's head. He made a face. She almost smiled. "He does seem better," Victoria said. "He is," Lucy said with the authority of the primary data source. "And so are you." Victoria looked at Lucy for a moment. The 7-year-old was already moving on to the business of deciding where Victoria's coat should go, which she had appointed herself to manage, and Victoria stood in the hallway of the apartment that was becoming theirs and felt something she had not expected to feel at 59. The particular lightness of a life that had stopped holding itself at a distance from what it wanted. She had built things her whole life. Companies, strategies, portfolios, plans. She was good at it, genuinely good, and she had stopped pretending otherwise around the same time she had stopped pretending the kitchen table dinners were casual. But the things you built with intent and capital and decades of expertise were different from the things you built by accident, by proximity, by leaving your door open and letting a child knock on it with a poster about sharks and a father who was sorry to bother you. The accidental things were the ones that lasted. She was starting to understand that. December came in cold and the apartment was warm, and Lucy had opinions about the Christmas tree that were extensive and non-negotiable, and Victoria had never had a Christmas tree in her apartment, not in 14 years of living alone, and the 3 of them went to get one on a Saturday morning, and it took significantly longer than planned because Lucy had a methodology for tree selection that required examining each candidate from multiple angles, and Ethan was trying to balance efficiency with the realities of a 7-year-old's process, and Victoria stood to the side and watched the 2 of them argue affectionately about a 6-foot Douglas fir and felt, with a clarity that sometimes surprised her still, that this was what had been missing from every previous version of her life, and that she had not known it was missing because she had not yet seen what it looked like. They got the tree. It was too big for the stand the first time, and Ethan had to trim the base, which he did on the sidewalk outside the building while Lucy supervised and Victoria held the tree upright, and a man walking his dog stopped to watch and said, "Beautiful family," as he passed, and nobody corrected him, and they didn't look at each other when he said it, just both continued doing what they were doing. But Ethan felt it land, and Victoria felt it land, and Lucy didn't hear it because she was talking to the dog. The tree went in the corner by the window. It was slightly too tall, and one of the branches in the back was bare, and they put it facing forward so the bare part was against the wall, and Lucy decorated it with the full collection of ornaments that included several she had made at school over the years that were misshapen and wonderful. and Victoria put the ones she could reach on the higher branches with the careful deliberation she applied to everything, and Ethan stood back and looked at it when they were done and said, "It looks good." "It looks like us," Lucy said. He looked at her. "What does that mean?" "A little uneven, but good," she said, matter-of-factly. Victoria made a sound that was a laugh that she hadn't finished deciding to make, and it came out honest and surprised, the way the best ones did, and Ethan laughed too, and the apartment was full of it for a moment. Real laughter, the kind that had no performance in it, the kind that told you exactly where you were. The proposal happened in February because some things completed the circle they started. He had thought about it for 2 months, not anxiously. The decision had been made in November in the kitchen when he said stay and she said yes, and both of them meant more than the word. But the how mattered to him. The form of it mattered, not for spectacle. He was not a spectacle person, and neither was she, but because there were things you did that needed to be done with the full awareness of what they meant. You didn't just let the important things happen at you. You chose them deliberately, with both eyes open. He chose the hallway. Victoria's 60th birthday was on a Thursday in February, which she had expressed no particular feelings about that, were positive and several that were not. And he had respected that. He had not made it a production, had not arranged something large or attended, had instead told her in November that he was cooking dinner and Lucy was baking something, and that was the plan. Take it or leave it. She had taken it, gratefully, in the way she took things that were sized right for what she actually needed, as opposed to what looked appropriate from the outside. Lucy baked a cake that was more lopsided than the last one, and tremendously proud of itself. Ethan made the dinner and did not attempt the tomato sauce because he knew when to acknowledge a benchmark he hadn't cleared. They ate at the kitchen table with birthday candles and the leftover December mood that still lingered in the apartment, something warm and accumulated in theirs. After dinner, when Lucy had been put to bed with the specific campaigning of a child who wanted to stay up on special occasions and had been given exactly 20 extra minutes, Ethan said, "Come here for a second." Victoria looked at him. "Where?" "Hallway." She looked at him for a moment with the full assessment. "Ethan." "Hallway," he said. She followed him out of the apartment and into the 7th-floor hallway of the Caldwell building, which was not a romantic setting in any conventional sense. It was a hallway, with the old carpet runner and the elevator at one end and the fire door at the other, and the particular light that had become, over 16 months, one of the most specific images in both of their lives. The hallway light was on. He had turned it on before dinner, the way he always did. The way he had been doing since November of the previous year, the year before that, before she had moved in, when it was still a message sent across a door and not a light inside a shared home. He turned to face her. She was already watching him. She had that look, the full one, no management, the look she had in the kitchen the first time and the night she said "I love you," and the morning she woke up on his couch with her shoes still on and found the lamp turned down low. She was watching him like she knew what was coming and was letting herself know and not pulling back from it. He reached into his jacket pocket. Not a ring, not yet. He had thought about it and decided against it, for reasons he would explain, and what he had instead was something smaller and more specific. It was a key. His key. The 1 to 7B, the apartment that was now theirs, but that was still, technically, on a lease in his name. He held it out. "I know you have a key," he said. "I know that's been settled for 3 months. But I wanted to give you one that I chose to give you." He paused. "And I wanted to ask you, while I'm doing it, Victoria Ashcroft, will you marry me?" Not a question, quite. Not a statement, quite. Somewhere in the specific register of a man who had learned that some things were better said simply, without the architecture of performance, just the fact of them, put forward like a structure you had built carefully and were now trusting to hold weight. She looked at the key in his hand. She had been married before. She knew what that meant and what it could cost and what the distance felt like between the version of a thing you entered into and the version you eventually inhabited. She had told herself a long time ago that the math on trying again didn't work in her favor. Too much history. Too set in the ways that came from decades of running your life on your own terms. Too aware of all the ways a person could mean something and still be wrong for you. She had not accounted for a man who left hallway lights on. She had not accounted for a 6-year-old who knocked on her door with a poster about sharks and a complete absence of agenda. She had not accounted for a kitchen that smelled like someone else's mother's tomato sauce and late nights, and the specific weight of being known by people who had chosen to know you rather than people who had simply acquired access to you. She had not accounted for any of this, and it had come anyway. The way the things that actually changed you always came. Not through the doors you were guarding, but through the ones you had left open by accident, in a moment of ordinary kindness, in a hallway in October when you were tired and someone said something true. She took the key. Yes, she said. The same word as November, the same register. Plain, full, the whole weight of it taken on without apology. He exhaled. She saw it. The long breath of a man who had been carrying something and had just put it down. And she stepped forward and he held her in the hallway with the old carpet and the old light. And from inside the apartment they could hear, distantly, Lucy moving around in her room with the specific energy of a child who had been put to bed and was not yet asleep. And the building settled around all of them the way old buildings did, with patience, with history, with the slow understanding of something that had seen many versions of people trying to make a life and recognized, perhaps, the particular quality of this one. They stood there for a moment. Then Victoria said, "You didn't get a ring." "I thought you might want to choose," he said. "You have opinions." "I have opinions about everything," she said. "I know, it's one of the things." She pulled back and looked at him. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that had been there when he met her, and that he had long since stopped seeing as anything other than part of her face, the record of a life that had been long and difficult and real in hers. She was 60 today. She looked like it, and she looked like herself, and those were the same thing. "I want something simple," she said. "Noted. Not because I can't. I just don't want something that needs explaining. I want something that just is what it is." "I know what you mean," he said. She nodded. She looked at the key in her hand. "You know what I've been thinking about?" "Tell me." "The night we met," she said. "At that dinner, I knew what it was. I knew what they were doing, and I sat down, and I was—" She paused. "I was very tired that night. Not from travel or work. From the kind of tired that builds up when you spend enough years doing things alone." She turned the key in her fingers. "And then you said something true, not to help me, not to impress anyone, just because it was true." She looked at him. "I didn't know what to do with that. I hadn't encountered it in a while." "I just said what I thought," he said. "That's what I mean," she said. "You just said what you thought. That's it. That's the whole thing." She closed her hand around the key. "That's why we're standing in a hallway in February." He thought about that. He thought about a dinner table and a laugh that came one beat too late, and a note tucked under a door and ginger broth at 2 a.m, and a cake that came out lopsided, and a child who said finally, and a light that had been left on more nights than he could count now, left on without thinking about it, the way you breathed without thinking about it, the way you did the things that had become necessary to who you were. He thought, some things don't have a lesson. They're just what happens when two people decide, in the small ways and the large ones, to keep showing up. He thought, but if there is a lesson, it might be this, that the love worth having is not the one you planned for. It's the one that arrives in the door you left open, not because you were brave, but because you were tired of closing them. It arrives in the way someone laughs when they're not expecting to, in the way a child says finally like she's been waiting for the adults to catch up. It arrives in hallways and kitchens and 2 a.m. with a container of broth that made too much, and it does not look the way you thought it would, and it is not easy, and it does not resolve neatly, and there will be bad weeks and missed dinners and mornings when you get it wrong and have to try again. But there will also be this specific hallway, this specific light, this woman who took a key with both hands like it was the thing she had been waiting to be given permission to hold. There will be this, if you let it be. Come inside, Bug, he said. She came inside. Lucy was in the kitchen, entirely awake, pretending to get a glass of water with the theatrical innocence of a child who had been waiting for exactly this. Why are you up? Ethan said. Water, Lucy said. It's 10:30. I was thirsty. Victoria sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Lucy with the full assessment. Did she say yes? Lucy said. Lucy, Ethan started. She said yes, Victoria said. Lucy set the water glass down. She looked at Victoria for a moment, then at her father, then back at Victoria, with the expression of someone whose internal ledger had just been brought into balance after a long accounting period. Good, she said. And then, as if this resolved everything, and she could now return to her other business. I knew she would. Did you? Ethan said. From the beginning, Lucy said. You were 6, Ethan said. I was right, Lucy said. She was. She had been, from the night she asked why Victoria wasn't already part of the family, from the morning she saved the note about the light, from every moment she had moved through this year with the complete assurance of someone who understood what was being built before the people building it did. Ethan looked at his daughter and thought about her mother, thought about Claire, which he did sometimes, not with the old weight, but with the older kind, the kind that was part of how he had become who he was, the kind that you carried gently because it deserved to be carried, and thought she got her mother's eyes and her mother's nerve and something that was all her own, which was this complete and undefended openness to the world, this willingness to see what was actually there and say so. He was grateful for it. He had been grateful for it since she was 2 days old, and he had been 26 and terrified, and she had looked at him with the absolute confidence of someone who had already decided he was enough. Bedtime, he said. 5 minutes, Lucy said. Bedtime. Victoria, tell him 5 minutes. Bedtime, Victoria said. Lucy looked at her. You're going to side with him about everything now. Not everything, Victoria said. Just bedtime. That's the most important one, Lucy said, with the dignity of the genuinely wronged. But she went. She hugged Victoria first quickly, the way she did things that mattered, without ceremony, without making it a moment, just the fact of it offered and done. And then she went down the hall, and her door closed, and the apartment was quiet. Ethan sat across from Victoria at the kitchen table. The dishes from dinner were still there. The birthday candles had burned down. Outside, February was doing what February did. The cold, the dark, the long, slow work of ending. Victoria had the key in her hand still. She set it on the table. He looked at it. That's been sitting on my counter for months, he said. Now it's mine, she said. It always was, he said. I just needed to say it out loud. She looked at him across the table in the kitchen that was theirs, in the apartment that was theirs, in the building that had held them through an October and a winter and a spring and a summer and another fall, and now this. Another February, a different one that had weight and history, and a lopsided birthday cake in the kitchen, and a 7-year-old down the hall who had known from the beginning. This was not the life she had planned. She had planned a different life. A cleaner one, a more explicable one. A life that could be described in a profile in a financial publication without a paragraph that required careful navigation. She had planned a life organized around the things she was unambiguously excellent at, because she had learned early that excellence was the thing that didn't let you down. She had not planned this kitchen. She had not planned the man across the table from her, or the child down the hall, or the light in the hallway that had become, over 16 months, the specific image she held on to in Amsterdam conference rooms and early morning car rides and late nights when the company required everything she had. She had not planned any of it, but she had built it anyway. They had built it, the three of them, not with capital and strategy and decades of expertise, but with dinners and honesty and ginger broth and the willingness, when it counted, to turn back at the lobby door and ask for the light. That was the whole thing. It wasn't grand. It wasn't the story you told to make yourself sound extraordinary. It was a light in a hallway and a person who left it on, and the decision, made every day in small and ordinary ways, to keep coming home to it. She reached across the table. He took her hand. Outside, the city was doing what the city always did. Moving, building, arguing with itself, making the sound of 10 million lives happening simultaneously. Most of them ordinary, most of them small, most of them exactly as important as this one. Inside, the kitchen was warm. The light was on. It had been on for a while now, and it was going to stay that way.